Well, today's gospel makes really uncomfortable reading, doesn't it? I acknowledge that Jesus was fully human and fully God, but I don't want him to be too human. Jesus is dismissive, harsh, and even insulting towards this poor woman who seeks his help. I find myself trying to rationalize and explain his words and actions so that he doesn't look bad or anything less than perfect. But that's the trouble and the wonder of the Bible, isn't it? There are many bits that we wish weren't in it, bits that make it difficult for us, that we wrestle with as individuals, let alone when asked about them by those who are seeking more about our faith. But I think that's what it's meant to be. The Bible is real because it's as earthy, honest, puzzling, challenging, and downright uncomfortable as it is wondrous, amazing, comforting, and inspiring. And these extraordinary texts aren't meant to be merely read and accepted, but to draw us into delving deeper, to ask difficult questions, to read around and into them, to discuss them and reflect upon how they shape our own faith and the way we live our lives. Turning to the lection in question, being aware of what comes before helps understand the context. Jesus' schedule has been pretty jam-packed. He's amazed the crowds by the feeding of the 5,000. He's healed many sick who were brought to him and had a run-in with the Pharisees who'd come to scrutinize him, which resulted in his offending them by pointing out the hypocrisy of honouring God with their lips, but not in their hearts. It's no wonder then that Matthew tells us that Jesus withdrew from the pressure of the crowds and went away with his disciples over the border into Phoenicia, the region near Tyre and Sidon. Now this was a foreign and therefore unclean territory, historically at odds with the house of Israel. St. Mark's narration of this event also implies that Jesus may well have been weary and seeking rest and refreshment, for in his account he says Jesus entered a house and didn't want anyone to know he was there. But the longed-for peace he seeks is short-lived. Enter a nameless woman, as are so many of the women in the Bible. How she got to know about Jesus and his whereabouts isn't recounted, but it may have been that the news of the feeding of the 5,000 had reached her ears. Whatever, this nameless female is altogether an undesirable, unclean, untouchable. She's a Canaanite, a long-time enemy of Israel, and a woman, and we can conclude a single parent of a girl child since she has no husband to speak for her. So she's a bottom of the pile nobody. And the final no-no, she has the audacity to demand an audience with a male who's both a stranger and a foreigner. Utterly desperate, she pleads loudly. Actually, the Greek translation is shrieks. She shrieks for her daughter. Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon. But Jesus didn't answer her at all. Why? Was he just too tired, utterly spent from his ministry? Perhaps he was in a deep sleep at this point, or was in deep prayer, or perhaps waiting to see his disciples and the woman's reaction. Whatever the reason for the silence, this woman doesn't give up. She turns to the disciples and goes on and on and on with her appeal. It's no good turning a deaf ear, for her petition is relentless, and the disciples just want to get rid of her. So they urge Jesus to do something. Send her away. She keeps shouting at us. The ensuing exchange, at first devoid of empathy and compassion upon Jesus' part, is shocking. But God's love and grace win the day, for Jesus, utterly radical for the time and context, resolvedly steps way over the cultural line to stand with the woman and commend her faith. Even so, we're left with really uncomfortable questions as to Jesus' initial treatment of her. What to make of that whole conversation? Well, as you can imagine, there are several interpretations to consider. One of the most widely accepted is that Jesus was testing that woman's faith. As a woman of a race at odds with the Israelites, was she really prepared to go against her whole culture by putting her trust in the God of Israel? Another, that Jesus' response was a teaching point, that Jesus looked around at his disciples as he spoke, deliberately voicing their unspoken thoughts and prejudices that he was about to radically challenge. As to that seemingly insulting reference to dogs, some commentators point out that the word translated as dogs can also be little dog or puppy, therefore softening Jesus' outrageous retort. New Testament professor Mitzi Smith explores this further, highlighting cultural differences between the derogatory Jewish attitude towards dogs and that of the more endearing of the Greeks and other Gentiles, suggesting that the woman's quick-as-a-flash reply to Jesus may well have stemmed from the feeding of pet dogs under the household table. Children and dogs can be fed together. There are other contemporary commentaries that put forward radical and challenging insights. Theologian and preacher David Lose is not alone in voicing the possibility that in and through this feisty encounter, Jesus' own sense of God's kingdom is challenged and stretched, and he learns that his mission to enact the kingdom is bigger than he initially imagined and more encompassing than he'd at first dreamed. Feminist preacher Sarah Bessey agrees and takes this further. She says, "What mother with a suffering child wouldn't howl all the way down the road? She refuses to let these men talk about her as if she isn't there. She gets in the way. She steadily holds her place. She doesn't get angry, she gets clever. And Jesus throws up his hands. He knows when he's beat. Perhaps he laughed ruefully. Fine, you win. She gets what she wants and her daughter is healed." Sarah goes on. It's in this story that we're reminded a bit too strongly that Jesus was fully divine and fully human too. Sometimes we lean so hard on the divine that we forget Jesus was also a product of his time and his culture. This passage reminds us in no uncertain terms that Jesus was a Jewish man in the first century, conditioned to believe that Gentiles were dogs and outsiders to the promise. So perhaps Jesus was taught by this woman. Much to think about. All in all, it's a text at once perplexing and shocking, deep and demanding, surprising and wondrous, and one that has much to say to us in our time. Austin Steelman, a Harvard Law School alumnus, writes, "Jesus listens to the Syrian-Phoenician woman, the outsider, the other. Jesus shows us in this story that inheriting bias is inevitable, but holding on to it is a choice." In amongst the fear and the upheaval of the pandemic, we have, in the wake of the brutal killing of George Floyd, witnessed the rekindling of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've witnessed countless refugees taking really desperate measures to reach a place of safety, many persecuted and displaced because of their ethnicity or creed or political views. We've heard accounts of young people who, desperate to belong, have become embroiled in gang warfare and lost their lives. So perhaps this passage may be an invitation to go deep within oneself, to ask what inherited bias lies there, to ask who, to me, to you, is the outsider, the other, to ask who do we need to listen to begin to understand and to learn from. For it's then that we can choose to be released from prejudice and stand in solidarity as we work for God's kingdom of justice, equity, and harmony. Amen.